Beat active 8075 to Hifaf historian 5476. You have debunked absolutely nothing of my factual timeline and info that predate any FBA. By the way, FBA didn't start going and being born in New Orleans until way after the 14th Amendment was passed and established in 1868, which means that FBA were able to safely and freely move from state to state after 1868. Most likely between 1880s and 1890s. But even between 1880s and 1890s the predominantly black culture was French, Spanish, Caribbeans, Creole aka Latino culture. There was no significant real British FBA culture or no British FBA cultural influences in New Orleans until after the 1920s. That's when the British FBA communities started to have some community numbers in New Orleans. So the main point highlighted is that New Orleans Creole cultural roots is the creation of jazz or jazz of any music ever created in New Orleans will always be New Orleans Creole culture, and never FBA culture. That's the facts, like it or not. A North American Slave Society. New Orleans in comparative view. New Orleans presents a unique opportunity to study slave society in comparative context because it developed under two of the major metropolitan powers and then became part of the United States. No less than three different legal systems and sets of attitudes need to be considered: French, Spanish, and Anglo-American. The overarching thesis here is that New Orleans was distinctive, like any community, having its own unique history resulting primarily from local social factors, and the prevailing cultural model of comparative analysis is unsound. Only a social model works consistently, a model in which culture plays an important but secondary role. In this chapter it will be demonstrated that New Orleans was not recognizably French or Caribbean, although its language, religion, and law were French. Similarly, in later chapters, it will become clear that it did not in any sense become Spanish after 1769, even though the official language, clergy, and law were Hispanicized. These three characteristics were of strictly secondary importance, the basic character of the community and its social structure being determined by its classes, demographic profile, export economy, and geographic situation, which made it a North American slave society. After 1803, New Orleans continued to. The slave societies of North America form a natural family, therefore, somewhat different from those of the Caribbean, particularly on account of demography. While New Orleans is the most distinctive slave society in North America because of its exceptional geographic isolation, it will be seen that it was indisputably North American in character, not Caribbean. The demographic character of the town was not at all like that of the major French West Indian societies, and very few of the settlers or slaves came from the West Indies until the very end of the colonial period, long after the town's essential patterns had been shaped by the original settlers and Africans. The social development of New Orleans was much like that of other slave societies in colonial North America, which is why it was incorporated so easily into the United States after 1803 without major cultural conflicts.
When the New Orleans-born historian Gwendolyn Midlo Hall passed at the age of 93 on August 29, 2022, she left behind a legacy of books and databases that restored historical identity and agency to the enslaved people of Louisiana. We salute her memory today by replaying this archival Hip Deep episode that featured her in 2005.
Gwendolyn Hall's research on the African presence in colonial Louisiana makes evident that in French and Spanish Louisiana an indigenous Afro-Creole culture emerged entirely independently from Caribbean influences. Archival data she uncovered prove that the French colonial rulers drafted their enslaved African workforce almost exclusively straight from the continent of Africa. Birth of a Creole culture. People of African descent in French and Spanish colonial Louisiana, 1699 to 1802. French colonial settlement of Louisiana began in 1699 with the expedition of Iberville and Bienville. Although there is evidence that Iberville had interest in acquiring African slaves for the colony as early as that year, records indicate that he had no success in this until 1709 and then only secure a small number. The 1708 census of Louisiana includes no persons of African descent, and the 1712 census, just 10. The colonists attempted to use Native Americans as enslaved laborers, but these efforts were met with great resistance and proved unproductive. In 1719, the first of many slave ships from Africa arrived in Louisiana. Estimates of the numbers of slaves who arrived in Louisiana throughout the years vary widely, but the more recent scholarship, which takes into account the mortality during the horrific Middle Passage and enumerates the people who actually disembarked and lived on in Louisiana, helps us to envision the rapidly growing African population of colonial Louisiana. The first two slave ships of 1719 together landed approximately 450 enslaved Africans, with ships bringing between 87 and 464 people each. By 1743, approximately 5,951 Africans had arrived in Louisiana. However, the survival rate among the enslaved Africans once in Louisiana was not good in the first years. By 1721, the census recorded only 680 Africans of the estimated 2,000 who had been brought into the colony by that point.
Colonization of Louisiana was extremely thin and not very effective and very insecure. There was a serious attempt to bring French colonists over in the early 1720s. I'd say from about 1717 on, they brought French colonists. A lot of them, though, were forced laborers or army deserters. In other words, it was sort of like Australia. It was kind of a criminal colonization. Not that these people were necessarily criminals, but by French law they were, like salt smugglers. And they brought women who misbehaved sexually. And these people didn't function very well in Louisiana, and the people who needed labor ended up by crying for Africans, and disparaging the French workers, saying that they were just non-functional. So the colonization of Louisiana relied very, very heavily on Africans, including African knowledge of rice cultivation, indigo cultivation, navigation, waterways, shipping, construction, so that the technology came heavily from Africa. And they went out of their way to get slaves who knew how to do this cultivation, because the French surely didn't know, and if they did, they wouldn't do it anyway. The first ship that was sent to collect slaves in Africa, first two ships, the captains were instructed to be sure to buy slaves who knew how to cultivate rice and barrels of rice seeds for cultivation. So there was this very conscious decision to do this. And indigo was not produced here until Africans had arrived. And of course, indigo was widely produced in the regions where most of the slaves were brought from.
Which is to say that the white population of early French Louisiana was heavily salted with crooks and whores who were worthless at farming.
So it was the Africans' agricultural know-how that saved the colony.
And started Louisiana eating its basic food to this day, rice.
So where in Africa did these African Louisianans come from?
The French documentation on the slave trade to Louisiana is very, very unusually complete, so that they give details about where the ship went, which ports, and how many slaves they collected, and how many slaves they landed live in Louisiana. And so we know pretty precisely that 2/3 of the slaves during the French slave trade were brought directly from Senegal. We know that those who were collected near the coast were mainly Wolofs, and those who were brought from the interior were mainly Bambara. It's better to say Bamana, but anyway, that's a long story I don't need to explain. But the Bamana were mainly males, and the Wolof were heavily females, so that the basic population which was born in Louisiana probably had more likely to have Wolof mothers and substantial numbers of Bamana fathers.
In Africans in Colonial Louisiana, Dr. Hall tells us that there were some 5,951 Africans brought to Louisiana on 23 slave ships during the French slave trade. Of those people, 3,909, just about two-thirds, came to Louisiana from the Senegal concession. 1,748 came from Ouida, which became part of the Kingdom of Dahomey, and there was one ship from Cabinda in northern Angola with 294 souls on board.
Now, they didn't have so many Senegambia in Cuba, right?
This is really interesting. The French were importing slaves to Louisiana right exactly at the time when the Segu uprising in West Africa was throwing a lot of Bambara captives on the market. But 2 centuries earlier, just as the first slave shipment was about to be sent to Cuba, Wolofs and Bambaras were specifically excluded by Spain from being brought to its territories.
Because?
Because the first slave uprising in the New World had just happened, in Spanish Santo Domingo in 1522, and many of the rebels were Wolofs. King Carlos of Spain responded with a royal order that prohibited bringing to the Spanish West Indies Wolofs or, quote, any others raised with Moors, although they be of the race of Guinea Negroes, close quote. In other words, no slaves from Islamized areas of Africa were to be brought to the Spanish colonies, so they didn't take large numbers of Senegambians to Cuba. Instead, they brought Congos, whom they bought from the Portuguese.
So does this play out in the music?
I think it does.
Gwendolyn Midlo Hall's research has been of paramount importance in unraveling the historical ethnic background of enslaved Africans in Louisiana. Under French rule, between 1719 and 1731, the initial wave came mainly through ports in westernmost Africa, Ile de Gorée, etc. They were people identified as Wolof, Fulbe, Bambara, Mandigo, but also Mina, Fo, Nago, Yoruba from the Guinea coast, and even Chamba from the hinterland in northeastern Nigeria, besides a few from the Congo, Angola region. Hall estimates that 2/3 of them originated from Senegambia.
Gwendolyn Midlo Hall adds several good reasons why New Orleans in this early period is the most African North American city. Most of the slaves came from the Senegal region of Africa and were referred to as Bambara. Though this need not be a label of tribal origin, it is an indication of a common language or even nationality, since this was the time of the greatest expansion of the Bambara Empire, and it is a significant factor that New Orleans courts employed a Bambara translator. The Bambara people were also known as avid merchants and excellent traders. Almost all of the black slaves arrived within 12 years after the founding of New Orleans, i.e. between 1722 and 1731, at which time blacks outnumbered Europeans 2-1. According to a census taken in 1731, there were 1,720 Europeans and 3,600 Africans in New Orleans at this time. There was a slave uprising with a Bambara as a leader in 1730. After 1731, New Orleans' economy went into decline and no further slaves were imported until the economy began to recover a good decade later. However, significant numbers came again under Spanish rule. In other words, slaves imported by the Spanish came into a well-formed creolized black culture. If language is an indication of cultural gelling, surely Louisiana Creole existed by 1760 when it appears in court records and is described by many observers. Also, the use of charms and gris-gris is recorded in New Orleans courts well before the Haitian refugees arrived.
In the 1830 U.S. Census, 3,776 free blacks owned 12,907 black slaves, predominantly in port cities like Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans. We also know that several free black women owned slaves, and that, in 1850 Charleston at least, women were a majority of black slave owners. In most cases, the persons owned were spouses, children, or siblings the owners were attempting to protect and, if possible, liberate. However, there were many who were slave owners who were also very good at business, such as Marie-Thérèse Coincoin, also known as Marie-Thérèse dit Coincoin, and Marie-Thérèse Metoyer. Who was Coincoin? What made her unique among black slave owners? What impact did her descendants have in history? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Coincoin was a Louisiana Creole born into slavery, August 1742 in Natchitoches Parish. Her owner was the Louisiana French Natchitoches Post founder and commandant Chevalier Louis Juchereau Saint-Denis. Her parents were supposedly Francois and Marie Francois. She was the fourth of 11 children. It is believed by some that Coincoin's parents were both African-born and retained much of that culture, and some evidence supports that. However, it is also contrary information that while her mother was an African-born slave, her father was possibly in fact a white French colonist. It is possible that her mother began a relationship with a white colonist at some point after her father died. That would mean all other siblings born after her were probably half white. The latter seems more likely because she was set free from slavery at a young age and went on to receive a sizable plantation from her father, who could have only been white to do that. She ran the plantation with the assistance of other enslaved people who she was given, and they worked for her. Despite her paternity, there is no known African birthplace for her mother, and Coincoin and 4 of her siblings carried African names. One Africanist historian proposed in the 1970s that the African name Coincoin, spelled variously by either French or Spanish scribes, was the name used for second-born daughters among those of the Iwe of coastal Togo who speak the Glidzi dialect, which were regions of West Africa heavily engaged in the European slave trade. Her biological father may have, in fact, been a slaver. At least he must have been a landowner. Coincoin grew up working in the fields from an early age, and we know that she was kept busy as a nurse, for which she was trained in the St. Denis household, while it was gripped by a plague in the 1750s that ran through Louisiana. In fact, as children, Coincoin and her sister, Mary Louise, were trained in pharmacology and nursing, which allowed them to earn a good living after gaining their freedom as adults. Their other 9 siblings would remain enslaved at various colonial posts from Natchitoches to Pensacola, Florida. The plague killed both of her parents and her mistress, so by the time she was 16, Coincoin had entered the household of her godmother, Marie de Soto. Around that time, she also began a relationship with a fellow slave named Chata, believed to be a mulatto with Indian blood as well as black, with whom she would have 5 children, the last being born in 1766 when she was 24. Chata's fate is unknown, but in 1765, her mistress granted Coincoin the right to live with the young French merchant Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, who had taken an interest in her during his many visits to the St. Denis household. He purchased her freedom in 1778, and over the years they both had 10 children. And being a free woman, she became quite well versed in business. She manufactured various medicines, planted tobacco, and trapped bears and turkeys and other animals for their skins and meat. Yet there was a lot of prejudice regarding interracial relationships, let alone marriages, and the parish priest tried using church law to break up their relationship in 1778. By filing charges that threatened to have her sold away to New Orleans. This is when Metoyer bought and then freed her, making her untouchable. Together they moved away to outlying lands where their liaison continued until 1788. As his mixed-race children matured and married, Metoyer manumitted, meaning he freed the eldest 5 of the 10 children whom he had held in slavery after he purchased Coincoin and their children. Coincoin continued doing her business. She sold her crops, animal skins, and meat to the local market in New Orleans and was quite successful. As a major landowner, taxpayer, businesswoman, and pious Catholic, she also volunteered her labor for the upkeep of the parish church. Like many other freed slaves in Colonial Louisiana, she eventually acquired slaves in order to protect them from others in the parish from purchasing them. She also purchased new slaves, as she was not a believer in brutal ownership and felt that she was a kindred spirit. Most of her slaves were at first related to her, or they were close friends and their children, and she worked the fields alongside them until her own health began to fail, possibly due to recurrent malaria or possibly having contracted scarlet fever. Coincoin lived a very frugal life and worked to help others, investing all of her income into buying freedom for the children from the slave marriage of her youth. By the time of her death, she had freed 3 of those children and 3 grandchildren. Another daughter and many grandchildren remained enslaved as their owners refused to free them or sell them to her. Marie's fortunes grew by virtue of her and her sons receiving land grants and purchasing slaves themselves. They became the leading family of a community called Isle Brevel, populated predominantly by freed slaves who thrived as business people, plantation owners, and surprisingly even slave owners. Various records state that she held one small farmstead of 67 acres, which was probably owned in conjunction with Metoyer, her grant, while other accounts show her later as the owner of a 12,000-acre plantation owning up to 200 slaves. That would make her the largest black landowner in colonial history. The liberal land grant policies of the Spanish crown, which adjoined the French possessions in Louisiana, allowed for anyone who was free to own land. As this was provided, a stake for her first farmstead on the Grand Coast of the Red River, now the Cane River, about 10 miles below the town. That 67 acres of bottomland adjacent to Metoyer's plantation was conceded by the local commandant in January 1787 and patented by the Crown in May 1794. It is identified on modern maps as sections 18 and 89 of Township 8 North, Range 6 West. Coincoin soon bought an additional large forested property on Old River to the west of her farm, a tract of land identified today as Section 55, Township 8 North, Range 7 West. This was where she established a cattle farm and hired a Spaniard to operate it for her. In 1807, she bought a third property of developed farmland, which are the northern portion of sections 34 and 98, T8 North, Range 6 West. This was actually within the French confines of the Louisiana Territory. This third purchase allowed for her younger son to own property, as he had come of age after the Louisiana Purchase, when the United States bought the territory from France. He was too late to benefit from the more liberal land policies of either the Spanish regime or the French government, but he could inherit land from his mother. Coincoin is credited with the founding of the Cane River's fabled Melrose Plantation. However, this land has been documented as a grant to her son, Louis Metoyer, who built most of the surviving plantation buildings prior to his death. Her son, Louis Metoyer, was still technically a slave of his father, Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, but Louis was deeded 911 acres of land from his father on which he would eventually build the famous Melrose Plantation. She and her descendants established the historical community of Isle Brevel of Creoles of color along the Cane River, including what is said to be the first church founded by free people of color for their own use, the St. Augustine Parish Church in Natchez, Louisiana. The church is included as a notable site on the Louisiana African American Heritage Trail. As Louisiana moved from being a territory to a state, with slavery becoming even more draconian, Coincoin's descendants maintained their freedom status, land, and still had their own slaves until the end of the Civil War. In fact, the slaves owned by the Metoyer clan granted their freedom years before, but they decided to stay on the plantations as sharecroppers working as freed people. As the Civil War loomed, the governor of Louisiana, Thomas Overton Moore, created the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, and it was the first official black regiment in the Confederate Army. The Guard was formed into the state militia as regiments of approximately 1,100 free African-American men who were French-speaking Creoles. When Governor Moore called for troops to defend Louisiana on April 17, 1861, a committee of 10 prominent New Orleans free blacks called a meeting at the city's Catholic Institute on April 22 to pledge their loyalty to the Confederate cause. About 2,000 people attended the meeting, including 1,500 free blacks who signed a militia muster roll. Many of these were the freed slaves of Coincoin's descendants. 3 white officers were appointed as regimental commanders, but in order to build unity, the company commanders were black Creoles chosen from the ranks of the unit. Among these Creole officers was one Lieutenant Andre Caillou, who was probably a great-grandson of Coincoin, who was already a free black man, who changed sides to fight for the freedom of others who were still slaves. Ironically, he would later join the Louisiana Native Guard Union Regiment and die in a heroic charge against Confederate forces at Port Hudson in 1863. Also among the officers was Lieutenant Morris W. Morris, who also served in the 1st Louisiana Native Guard Regiment. Lieutenant Morris had the distinction of being the only black Jewish officer in the Confederate Army and later the only black Jewish officer in the Union Army. The Confederate leadership was somewhat uncomfortable having black soldiers within their ranks. The 1st Louisiana Native Guard was never provided uniforms or weapons, so most of the men used their own resources for both clothing and weapons. Being freed men, most already had long guns. In January 1862, the Louisiana State Legislature passed a law that required militia members to be white. On February 16, 1862, the 1st Louisiana Native Guard was disbanded. 2 months later, on April 26, 1862, the U.S. Army and Navy commanders accepted the surrender of New Orleans. Some of the men of the Guard were approached by Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler to fight against the Confederates. About 10% of them accepted this offer, and in September 1862, they became the nucleus for the 1st Louisiana Native Guard United States Army. Many of these were direct descendants of Coincoin. Therefore, it is easy to see how complex the early relationships were for both black slaves, former slaves, and other ethnic groups working for a common goal, whether in peacetime or during wartime. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.
Digging deeper into the past, we encountered another story that resonated with Brittany's life today. It begins over 100 years earlier, with her 7th great-grandparents, a couple named Marie Coincoin and Pierre Metois. Records show that Marie was born into slavery in Louisiana around 1742. While Pierre was a white man born in France around the same time. They met in Louisiana in the 1760s, when Pierre leased Marie from a neighbor so that she could work in his home. Over the next 10 years, they would conceive several children together, a fact that outraged a local priest, so much so that he filed a complaint against the couple. Reading it over, Brittany began to have serious reservations about Pierre's treatment of Marie during those 10 years.
I mean, the fact that she was, loaned out, basically, to...
She's a slave.
She's literally a slave. And, I mean, was it against her will at first, and then she fell for him? Or was it she felt mutual? Like, those are the questions that are going through my head.
We don't know how it started, but we know how it ended, okay? Please turn the page.
I know I got a lot of questions when I get home.
This is the same record we just showed you, only we've highlighted a different portion. Would you please read that transcribed section?
Coincoin and Metois, in whose house and company the said unmarried negress has produced 5 or 6 mulatto children, not counting the one with whom she is now pregnant. This cannot happen in the house of an unmarried man and an unmarried woman without the public thinking and judging there to be illicit intercourse between the two partners in concubinage.
You got it.
From this, there has ensued a great scandal and damage to soul.
Damage to soul.
Damage to soul.
This white
bro.
man is living with his lover. They have 6 children, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this priest is going nuts. And he files a complaint against them. I mean, the priest has said this is a sin in the sight of man and God, and we got to do something about it.
I know that priest was losing his wig. Oh, my God.
We have no idea how Brittany's ancestors felt about the priest's accusations, but we do know how they responded. In July of 1778, less than a year later, Pierre purchased Marie from her owner, and then he freed her.
Ooh.
What do you think that was like for Marie, finally to get her freedom?
I mean, I would think she would feel safe. This man has done everything for her, honestly. Like, she has a family through him. He bought her and set her free and made sure she had her freedom.
There are a lot more cases of a white male fathering children with a black woman who was never freed.
Yeah.
Now, Brittany, did he love her or not?
He loved her.
Although Marie was now free, she and Pierre still faced a terrible problem. They had 7 children who remained in bondage because the law dictated that the children of an enslaved woman followed the condition of their mother and thus were the property of her owner, even if the man who had fathered them was free. Fortunately, Pierre had a solution. He did what the law demanded and purchased each of his children and emancipated them, securing his family's freedom for generations to come.
Now, that's a story.
That's a story.
That's a story. That's a story I can be proud of, honestly. And it makes me think those 10 years were not hell for her now. Like, to someone that did all that and then to go by the 7 children as well, to go above and beyond and do that as well, let you know, like, he actually did care. Like, at some point, his mind changed, and I can respect a family member that does that. Like, yeah, you had some bad intentions, maybe, potentially in the beginning, but I see you made a change. I can respect somebody that makes a change.
Hey there, welcome to Newsroom International. I'm Suzanne Malveaux. We're taking you around the world in 60 minutes. Here's what's going on now.
Suzanne Malveaux is one of America's leading broadcast journalists. An intrepid reporter, she spent more than a decade as CNN's White House correspondent, interviewing Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Like Bryant Gumbel, Suzanne has roots that stretch back to Jim Crow, Louisiana, where both of her parents were raised. She grew up hearing stories about their experiences under segregation.
My mother would talk about the walk that she had to make to school to get to the colored school or the black school. She would pass the church that was whites only. She'd pass the schools that were whites only. She'd pass the pools that were whites only. She used to walk with her brother, and he used to get beaten up every day. She cried, and they would run home together.
These stories help shape Suzanne's sense of her own identity as an African American. Nevertheless, she's aware that that identity is not immediately apparent to most people.
So when someone asks you, who are your people? Where do you come from? You know that question? Meaning,
Yes.
what are you? What do you say?
People are really confused about what I am, and I tell them I'm black. Both my parents are a combination, I guess, that Creole New Orleans mix. And so in our immediate family, 2 of us will identify as African American, 2 identify as people of color, and 2 identify as black. And I'm one of those who identify as black.
What do you get mistaken for most? I bet nobody guesses that you're black.
Well, you know, it's funny because I think most black people know I'm black. They can see it. But yeah, I mean, I can go anywhere in the world and they think like I kind of blend into wherever it is that I travel. So when I'm in Egypt, they think I'm Egyptian. When I was in Kenya, they thought I was half Kenyan, half white or European. So it almost depends on where I am. And then people kind of assign me that identity.
Suzanne told me that while she had some trouble explaining these confusions in her youth, she's long since adjusted. In fact, she's even used them on occasion to her own advantage.
Have you ever been in a conversation when people didn't know you were black and they were saying bad things about black people?
Oh, yes.
So you're like a double agent?
Yes. That has happened before. Oh, yes. Then comes the surprise when you actually tell them.
I'm gonna go black on you.
I did a story where it was the 2008 election, and what people were thinking about Barack Obama, and people, you know, freely were really kind of throwing out some racial slurs and things like that. And I think in that moment, I think they didn't know. They didn't realize that, yes, there was a black woman in front of them who was collecting information, and they were speaking very freely. And I did use that to my advantage.
Did you tell them that you were black or no?
Not in that circumstance.
No, right.
No.
You did the right. You were a good reporter.
I told the story. You got the story.
Like Bryant, Suzanne Malveaux's roots lie in Louisiana. Her ancestors have lived there since the 1700s. And since she was a girl, Suzanne has longed to know about their lives. She told us that her father had researched his family intensely before reaching an impasse.
After Alex Haley's Roots came out, my dad kind of dusted off the big chart that he made. He was very passionate about finding out our ancestry. And what the folklore was and what he found out was that there were 2 slaves that had French names, Laurent and Jean-Baptiste. And we suspect that maybe they came on a ship, but we're not exactly sure like how they ended up with their French names.
As it turns out, Suzanne's father did an excellent job, up to a point. Using census data and vital records, we were able to confirm much of his research, tracing his family back 6 generations to a man named Laurent Malveaux, who died in Louisiana around 1830. Laurent was the name that Suzanne's father had ascribed to one of his enslaved ancestors. But that's where his research started to break down.
Laurent Malveaux, free man of color, lately died in said parish and left therein his estate.
You're looking at the will of your 4th great-grandfather.
Wow, he was free.
You have free ancestors on the Malveaux line going back at least to your 4th great-grandfather, who was a man of color and free.
It's amazing. It makes me feel really fortunate. So many others suffered, and we were spared some of the crueler aspects of our nation's history, you know, that we were able to somehow in some way prosper.
Laurent Malveaux was prosperous indeed. In 1830, he was running his own plantation. But Laurent's story was far more complicated than it seemed at first.
This is the inventory section of your 4th great-grandfather's estate. It lists and values all the property that he owned.
A Negro man named John, about age 30 years, with his 2 children, to wit William, a boy aged about 7 years, and Desiree, a girl aged about 3 years.
Your 4th great-grandfather was a slave owner, a black slave owner.
That's really tough. It's hard to breathe. I'm having a hard time breathing.
It may be hard to comprehend, but Laurent's story was not as unusual as you might think. In 1830, there were over 900 black slave owners in Louisiana, which means roughly 40% of the state's free black households contained slaves. Their rationale in many cases was to protect family members. But sometimes, the motivation was purely economic. To succeed as a planter, white or black, you needed the labor of slaves. But as we dug deeper into Laurent Malveaux's papers, we found that not all of his slaves were treated the same. In 1818, he purchased a 40-year-old woman named Constance from his neighbor. Soon after, Laurent freed Constance, but she remained in his household, and more than a decade later, he made an astonishing declaration about their relationship.
Your petitioner is desirous to emancipate his two slaves, to wit, a Negro girl named Celeste, aged about 15 years, and a Negro girl named Hortense, aged about 12 years. The reason by which he is induced to emancipate his said slaves is that he is the father, right, of said slaves by a free woman of color named Constance, formerly the slave of your petitioner. So he and Constance have two children.
Mm-hmm.
So he buys a slave, and he and the slave woman have two children?
Yeah. And then he frees the mother of his children and then frees his children.
Do we know if they had a relationship? Did they have a real loving relationship?
We only know what the documents tell us. He freed her. He freed the children. Many slave owners never admitted that they fathered a slave's child.
Maybe these children were special to him in some way.
We don't know. All we can do is look at those cold, dry, black and white documents and wonder.
It's a complex story.
Yeah. But one of the hidden aspects of black history is that we had black slave owners too. Nobody wanted to talk about it. People found it embarrassing. But this is a fact of American history.
If I could go back, I'd love to understand what all of them were thinking on both sides, because that's, everybody has that potential. We are human beings, and we're all capable of cruelty and goodness.
Right.
This is a lot.
We had already taken Suzanne's roots back 6 generations to Laurent Malveaux, the black slave owner who died in Louisiana around 1830. We wanted to go further. Suzanne's father was convinced that the Malveaux name originated in France, meaning that somewhere back in his family tree, a white man of French descent had fathered a child with a woman of African descent. While this idea seemed plausible, we couldn't find a record to support it. So we turned to DNA and looked at Suzanne's father's Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son in an unbroken line, which means it could lead us back to the place where the male Malveaux originated. Are you ready to see what we found?
I want this mystery solved.
All right.
Yes.
So please turn the page. So this test shows where your father's 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 people came from back thousands of years. What's it say?
Sub-Saharan African. That's amazing.
Your Y DNA goes to Africa. Does this surprise you?
Well, yes, because we always thought there was somebody from France.
Which was logical.
That was the story.
Which was logical. Your ancestor was fathered by a black man. And the proof of it is that Y DNA goes straight back to Africa.
Wow. Yeah. That was a story that just kept going.
DNA had answered one question, only to raise another. If the Malveaux male line extended in an unbroken chain back to Africa, when did they start mixing with Europeans? Our search led us to the marriage record of Suzanne's third great-grandfather, a man named Jean-Baptiste Laurent Malveaux. Can you read whom he married?
Charlotte Rochon.
Have you ever heard that name, Charlotte Rochon?
There's some friends, family friends, who are Rochons.
Yeah, well, they're related to you. Charlotte Rochon is your third great-grandmother.
Wow.
And let me show you what we learned about her.
Okay.
Would you please turn the page?
Sure.
Suzanne, here's the 1850 census from St. Martin Parish. This would have been recorded 5 years after Laurent and Charlotte got married.
Laurent Malveaux, age 46, color black.
Black.
Charlotte, age 38, color mulatto.
That's right. And what's that tell us?
She's mixed.
Ding. Charlotte Rochon had white ancestors.
Wow.
Charlotte Rochon is the first person on the Malveaux line whom we could identify as having European roots. And she led us back another 4 generations, back to a man named Charles.
Danced the tumba when these groups were spreading the ideas of independence. The Spanish were the first to ship Africans to the West Indies. The French planted coffee and sugarcane. They needed a lot of cheap labor to grow the plants. They shipped more slaves than anyone else. They loaded them on the coasts of Guinea, Niger, and the Congo. They even went as far as Mozambique to get them, the other side of Africa. How many of our ancestors were packed into the slave ships? Millions. How many arrived? So many died during the trip. Ill treatment, epidemics, despair. The trip took weeks. I heard so many horrible stories. The slave trade was a great tragedy. When Toussaint Louverture threw the French out of Haiti, the plantation owners left for Cuba. Their house slaves came with them. Their fate was linked to that of their masters. Our ancestors landed here, in the Bay of Santiago. It's a magnificent sight, don't you think?
Cuando ocurre la revolución haitiana, que como todos sabemos es la primera revolución triunfante en el mundo, dirigida y ejecutada por negros, africanos y afrohaitianos. Y ya para los 1800 comienzan las diferentes oleadas, llegadas de emigrantes franceses desde Haití. Estos podían ser blancos, estos podían ser ya mestizos o mulatos. Y llegaron otros franceses directamente de Francia. Estos hombres también vinieron como colonos.
The massive migration of Haitians to New Orleans did not take place until 1809, when large numbers of Haitian refugees, including white Creoles, free Colorids, and their slaves, were expelled from Cuba in reaction to Napoleon's invasion of Spain.
So, Ned, how did the people from Saint-Domingue, or as we call it today, Haiti, wind up in Louisiana?
Most of them came over not from Saint-Domingue, but from Cuba.
And that was in 1809, right?
Exactly, in 1809 and 1810. A number of the Saint-Dominguean refugees who were in eastern Cuba found themselves suddenly persona non grata in Cuba and had to get out, thus going into exile for the second time in 7 years. Our special guest today, Dr. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, explained it like this.
Napoleon invaded Spain and put his brother in as a king of Spain. And there was such a reaction against this in Cuba that they expelled the Haitians. And so these were about 10,000 people. About a third of them were free people of color who owned slaves. Another third were so-called white Creoles of Haiti who also owned slaves, and the other third were the slaves owned by either group. And these people were expelled between 1809 and 1810. They showed up in New Orleans in a whole bunch of shipments, so that there was a sudden introduction of Haitians into New Orleans, and this doubled the free colored population in New Orleans, so that about half the free coloreds were Haitians.
The importation of slaves into the United States was prohibited as of 1808. So in 1809, it was no longer legal for these Dominican slave owners to bring in their slaves to Louisiana. But because they had no other property left, the Dominican slave masters were allowed to keep their slaves by a special act of Congress.
So if these black Dominicans from Cuba were brought in as slaves by a special loophole after the door had slammed shut on slave importation, these people would have been the last slaves imported into the United States legally.
They were.
Orleans in 1809. When Cuba deported many of the French colonials who had settled there 6 years earlier, Louisiana was the preferred destination of those leaving from the ports of Baracoa and Santiago de Cuba. According to a special report made by the mayor of New Orleans, 9,059 Saint-Domingue refugees from Cuba arrived between May 1809 and January 1810. Additional arrivals in the first months of 1810 pushed the total to more than 10,000. By comparison, only several hundred refugees arrived in the last decade of Spanish rule and roughly 1,000 at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. All three castes were well represented in the influx of 1,809 to 2,731 whites, 3,102 free persons of color, and 3,226 slaves. In 1809, roughly 10,000 refugees from the former French colony arrived in New Orleans. They had first fled to Cuba, but finding them too troublesome amid the continuing Napoleonic Wars, Spanish colonial officials in 1809 expelled them. That launched a flotilla of boat people mostly from the southeastern ports of Baracoa and Santiago de Cuba, which sat directly across the windward straits from what had become Haiti. Baracoa lay only 150 miles northwest of Cap Haitian, Haiti. Santiago de Cuba lay 250 miles from the Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince. New Orleans lay about 1,100 miles northwest of the two Cuban ports. Reportedly, only one boatload of refugees landed in New Orleans from Havana, 670 miles away. Louisiana History Table. Refugee movement of 1809 compared to the population of Orleans Parish in 1806 and 1810. By racial caste, almost all the refugees expelled from Baracoa and Santiago de Cuba sailed for New Orleans. From May 1809 to January 1810, the mayor counted 9,059 refugees arriving from Cuba. Of this total, 2,731 were white, 3,102 were free persons of color, and 3,226 were slaves. The last represented almost a third of the 1810 census. Origins of Louisiana's antebellum plantation economy. In 1795, on a French Creole plantation outside of New Orleans, Etienne de Boré's enslaved workforce, laboring under the guidance of a skilled free black chemist named Antoine Morin, produced Louisiana's first commercially successful crop of granulated sugar, demonstrating that sugar cane could be profitably grown in Louisiana. At roughly the same moment, American inventors were perfecting new mechanized cotton gins, the most famous of which was patented by Eli Whitney in 1794. These machines, which removed cotton seeds from cotton fibers far faster than could be done by hand, dramatically increased the profitability of cotton farming, enabling large-scale cotton production in the Mississippi River Valley. The simultaneous introduction of these two cash crops, sugar cane and cotton, represented an economic revolution for Louisiana. Prospective planters flooded into the territory, carving its rich, river-fed soils into sugar and cotton plantations. Yet in 1803, Congress outlawed the international importation of enslaved people into the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase territory. While 4 years later, in 1808, Congress outlawed the transatlantic slave trade entirely. To provide labor for this emerging economic machine, slave traders began purchasing enslaved people from the Upper South, where demand for enslaved people was falling, and reselling them in the Lower South, where demand was soaring. By 1860, more than 124,000 enslaved Africans and African Americans had been carried to Louisiana by this domestic slave trade, destroying countless families while transforming New Orleans into the nation's largest slave market. Louisiana's enslaved population exploded, from fewer than 20,000 enslaved individuals in 1795 to more than 168,000 in 1840 and more than 331,000 in 1860. Between 1820 and 1830, they doubled in number from 7,355 to 14,440, mostly because of domestic imports at the end of the decade. In a letter written in March 1830, a Saint-Domingue refugee living in New Orleans reported that so many American slaves were being imported that they will soon be more numerous than Creoles and foreign slaves both in the country and in the city. Only house servants of American birth are to be seen in every home. In January 1831, he wrote that over the 2 preceding years more than 20,000 slaves had been introduced into the state, and complained that everywhere one only hears English spoken, for in every house there are a number of old servants who have become fluent in this idiom. One can imagine the inconvenience to unilingual French-speaking masters of household slaves conversing in a language they did not understand. By providing such masters with an incentive to learn English, slaves may well have contributed to their Americanization.
Nearly 500,000 Africans survived the Middle Passage, eventually arriving in the United States. But a second Middle Passage, inside our country, was over twice as large in scale. The domestic slave trade fueled the nation's booming cotton economy, and in the process, shattered black families. After Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, cotton exploded as a cash crop.
You have this technological innovation. The cotton gin makes it quicker, easier to separate the seed from the cotton boll itself. And you also have the Louisiana Purchase and the seizing of indigenous Native American land. As a result of that, you have this new land in the West. You have a demand for cotton and a demand for labor.
Slave owners from states in the Upper South sold their slaves to traders, who then transported them to the cotton-producing states in the deeper South and further to the West. This came to be known as the Second Middle Passage, and its effects on the African American community would be devastating.
They were forcibly sold, separated from families, husbands from wives, parents from children, siblings from one another, forced to make these trips, chained and bound together, and clearing the way for settlement of white Americans.
About 1 million slaves moved between these older states and the newer states in the South over the course of 3 decades in the 19th century. So there's this massive slave trade domestically that attends the opening up of the cotton territories and the rise of the cotton kingdom in the South.
Countless families became the victims of the largest forced migration in our country's history. but there were huge profits to be made off of black bodies. Once they arrived at their destination, families that had made the journey together often were ripped apart.
As the slave trade did in Africa, the domestic slave trade scrambles any kind of community that black people had come to know, and it leads to this new round of massive alienation and forces them to start all over again.
This horrendous dislocation lasted until the Civil War began. But the consequences of the Second Middle Passage devastated generations of black families.
In the rural setting, a large number of American free people of color had arrived around 1790 from Virginia, North and South Carolinas and settled all over South Louisiana. Their families had intermarried for generations and knew one another before arriving in Louisiana, ensuring continued endogamy in rural South Louisiana. The Chavises, now Chevis, Drakes, Sweats, Gibsons, Nelsons, Johnsons, Ashworths, and others, were among these American free people of color families. John Chavis, free mulatto, native of North Carolina, appears in the 1792 colonial census of the Opelousas district. But he and his wife, Rachel Keyes, also appear in Catholic parochial records in the Lafourche district in this same decade. Unlike most members of this American free people of color community, John and Rachel's children left their parents' community to marry into local Creole communities. Aaron Drake of Elizabeth County, Virginia, and his two sons Paul and John, all free mulattoes, registered cattle brands in the Attakapas district in 1807. In 1811, George Nelson, a free man of color from Bladen, North Carolina, married a free woman of color named Elizabeth Betsy Carter, widow of Robert Swett, in Opelousas. Betsy was a native of Caswell, North Carolina. Frances Fanny Nelson and Gilbert Taylor Nelson, two children of George by his first marriage to Delaney Taylor, married Johnson's siblings David and Rebecca, natives of the Edgefield District, South Carolina, children of Gideon Johnson and Nancy Swett. By 1830, we find this nucleic community living huddled together on Bayou Teche near Grand Coteau, on the Mermentau River, and on the Calcasieu River. Thus, Creoles and Americans of various degrees of African descent shared the same land, but separate cultural milieu and residential settlement patterns. Introduction. These genealogies, comprising the colonial history of the majority of the free African American families of Virginia and North Carolina, reveal several facets of American colonial history previously overlooked by historians. Most families were the descendants of white servant women who had children by slaves or free African Americans. Many descended from slaves who were freed before the 1723 Virginia law, which required legislative approval for manumissions. Families like Goen, Cumbo, and Driggers who were free in the mid-17th century had several hundred members before the end of the colonial period. Very few free families descended from white slave owners who had children by their slaves, perhaps as low as 1% of the total. Many free African American families in colonial North Carolina and Virginia were landowners who were generally accepted by their white neighbors. Free Indians blended into the free African American communities. They did not form their own separate communities. Some of the light-skinned descendants of free African Americans formed the triracial isolates of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Louisiana.
Hidden in the midst of the Appalachian Mountains are secrets.
I don't think that we can really go back far enough that we can establish exactly how they got here or who they were.
A mystery.
A matter of self-preservation.
A people.
Melungeon was a stigma.
Forgotten. On purpose.
I don't fault any of my ancestors for trying to preserve their lives.
Dark skin.
That a lot of people were really upset because they may be classified as being black.
The dark-skinned, blue-eyed people who settled at the feet of the mountains in a town called Vardy, many people believe are a mixed race made up of European, Native Americans, maybe even shipwrecked Portuguese sailors.
We have very few people who will agree on any of the theories about their origins. Everyone has a different spin.
But one spin is they come from African descent.
So they kind of shut up and were quiet about their ancestry.
These whispers in the mountains echoed through generations, but the secrets stayed trapped, covering up who they were, afraid for their lives to admit they had any African blood in their veins.
Go back to the 1800s. Would you want to admit that you were African American and become a slave? No.
For all we don't know, one thing we do. They suffered.
Although many historians and ordinary people today assume that all free people of color in Louisiana were Creoles, it is ahistoric to assume so. In the summer of 1812, the Louisiana legislature, in its first session as a state, enacted the incorporation of state militias, composed of certain free men of color, to be chose from among the Creoles. The provision excluded Americans who were free people of color. Free African Americans and Melungeons had been in Louisiana for 3 decades by 1812. In New Orleans, these free people of color can be found in the American municipalities, uptown. In 1825 or 1826, Asa Goldsberry founded the first African Baptist church in New Orleans with 20 members. Goldsberry's congregation grew out of an earlier Baptist congregation in New Orleans with a white and a non-white minister catering to each separately.
Stories and what does it mean to be an American? And I've been doing a little bit of work on Melungeon heritage. I had planned on interviewing some folks about it, then we got COVID here at our house, and I'm still kind of on the upswing, still drinking tea instead of coffee, which is not like me at all. But that being said, I can talk to you from here in my office and not worry about being sick. So I wanted to show you some DNA tests I found for folks who are wondering if they have Melungeon ancestry or who have the paper trail of last names that are familiar for those in that community. Now, I only recently realized I have a lot of family members, a lot of lineage that looks like it is part of the Melungeon community. And if you're not familiar with what Melungeon is, it's kind of similar to Redbone. There are differences, which I'm planning on talking about in another video. But it is this isolated, triracial, for the most part, community. And it's in, I used to say Appalachian, or Appalachian, because I'm from New York. But I've had a few people tell me that's totally wrong, and I think it's Appalachia. Now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if I can remember how I'm supposed to say it. Appalachia. I think it's Appalachian. I'm going to get it. But that being said, I want to show you some of the DNA tests that I found. And on Reddit, people will share their tests on 23andMe, on Ancestry DNA. Super interesting. I love when people share their results like this. But there's always this caveat of the tests change so much, at least they did for me, that I feel like the numbers in some contexts are worthless. Now I know they're not really worthless, but you don't want to put like all of your everything, all of your eggs in this basket of the percentages that you see. That being said, I want to share a couple of these with you. So I'm going to switch over to the screen sharing view so we can talk about it. Okay, so this one's called Do I Have Melungeon Ancestry? It's from 2 months ago. And this person says, I'm pretty interested to know if I may have Melungeon in me. Most of my family has lived in northern Alabama and southern northeast Tennessee for many years, with many of them having roots in Virginia and North Carolina. So these are some of the like touch points for this community. And through research, some of my ancestors were free mixed people who are of Irish descent who lived in Huntsville, Alabama, which I think is technically part of the Appalachian. So they're kind of looking for hints in their DNA. Now, I don't see any last names on this post. And there's another post I'm going to show you that people did bring up their family names, which is very helpful. So this person's test, it had 82% sub-Saharan African with a high Nigerian. Just as an aside, when I was doing some research on my Creole side, I saw that a lot of Creole people will have high Benin and Togo and Nigeria, which my family does. Like those are the areas that were the highest for African. So that was interesting too, because we do have to take into consideration a lot of this African DNA, if not all of it, is coming from enslaved people. And enslaved people were brought from different parts of Africa to different parts of the United States. And you will see concentrations of that history in DNA. So a lot of sub-Saharan African, European, Portuguese, not high Portuguese. I shared in another video that I have like 6% Portuguese, which I always wrote off as really being Spanish, but that seems to be a history of the Appalachian area. And then this person had some Filipino, but sometimes the Native American can be hidden as Asian. So here's the results. And so this person had responded and said, great question. I'm of Melungeon descent myself. Whether or not you have Melungeon ancestry is actually not something you can derive from only a DNA test. This is true. And I would even say any of these groups like Creole or Puerto Rican even, because my husband has Puerto Rican ancestry, and it doesn't necessarily show up as an ethnic breakdown. It might be a community where they're saying a lot of people in this Puerto Rican community have similar DNA. But I haven't seen a Melungeon community. So let me know if you've seen that on one of these tests. There are no Melungeon genes, and everyone who is mixed in Appalachia is not Melungeon. Rather, Melungeon refers to a certain set of mixed race families in the region who have a particular history to early colonial Virginia. So how do you figure out if you're Melungeon, they ask. It sounds like you already know you have family in Appalachia. That's a good start. So I just absolutely love this tying into the colonial Virginian history. And I really want to go down this path with you guys. I think it'd be really interesting to do that. So now I want to show you an article that I saw a couple months ago, and then my friend Dan Schneider had mentioned it to me again. And it's a DNA study about the Appalachian Melungeons. And the title of it is "A Whole Lot of People Upset About This Study." I think when scientists start delving in, scientifically probing into communities, trying to get definitive answers, I think we realize that they butt up against some stuff. There are cultural things that sometimes I think can contradict the DNA indicators, where people are a part of a community, they're part of a culture, but maybe their DNA is not reflecting what we would expect from that. And I'm guessing that's something that happened here. But I was really excited about this because one of the men who did the project, he is a Goins, which I have in my family line. My maternal line is Goins. So I wanted to read part of this article too, and let's talk a little bit about this DNA. For years, varied and sometimes wild claims have been made about the origins of a group of dark-skinned Appalachian residents, once known derisively as the Melungeons. Some speculated they were descended from the Portuguese explorers, or perhaps from Turkish slaves or gypsies. Now, I'm pretty sure gypsies is not a thing that that group prefers. I think they like to call themselves the Romani, I think. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what I've been told. Now, a new DNA study in the journal of Genetic Genealogy attempts to separate truth from oral tradition and wishful thinking. So here's the issue, right? Like there may be some truth to what's about to be revealed here, but it also doesn't negate the fact that for generations, groups of people have been identifying a certain way, or they've had this oral tradition, and I think that there's some validity to that as well. The study found the truth to be somewhat less exotic. Genetic evidence shows that the families historically called Melungeons are the offspring of sub-Saharan African men and white women of Northern or Central European origin. So it's a peer-reviewed journal, but it doesn't sit comfortably with some people who claim Melungeon ancestry. Quote, there were a whole lot of people upset by this study, lead researcher Roberto Estes said. They just knew they were Portuguese or Native American. And here's Jack Goins. So I am assuming I'm related to him. The Goins family is, I think, probably all from one line, and they split. So beginning in the early 1800s or possibly before, the term Melungeon was applied as a slur to about 40 families along the Tennessee-Virginia border. But it has become a catch-all phrase for a number of groups of mysterious mixed-race ancestry. Now, what's interesting to me is this idea of like, it's been so mysterious, and then to come in and say, oh, well, actually, they're just mixed with African and European. That doesn't really seem very mysterious. I feel like you would know that that is the mixing. But what I'm guessing is something that I hope to talk about in the future, but this idea of the multi-generational mixed person. And I think that is how I would look at my family, because we're not looking at people who were just 50% European of some kind, 50% from some African country. But these are people that have been mixed for a long time, marrying other people who've been mixed for a long time. And I think it just comes out a little bit differently when it is these multi-generational experiences of being mixed people. So in recent decades, interest in the origin of Melungeons has risen dramatically, which of course, people could take DNA tests now and we can kind of solve these family questions. All of us are multiracial, says a sociologist in California. It's recapturing a more authentic U.S. history. I could not agree more. So the claims of Portuguese ancestry were likely a ruse in order to remain free and retain other privileges that came with being considered white, according to the See, 1806 is a really important year. On one coast, you're being told you've got to leave or you're going to become enslaved again. Like, we don't want any free people of color here anymore. But that same year, 1806, something happens, some unprecedented agreement happens between two nations to create no man's land. Hi, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel. I'm Danielle Romero, and here we talk about American identity and family stories. I have just loved this new format of us hanging out this way and kind of getting back into the focus on actual family stories. I think this is a really misunderstood topic. When I first went to Louisiana, I grew up in New York. When I first went to Louisiana to meet some of my family a couple years ago, I immediately had someone call me a Redbone, and I didn't know what that meant. I knew the band, Redbone, really great song, Come and Get Your Love. But I didn't know what it meant. And it's such a loaded phrase because it means something in the Black community. And that is tangentially related to the historical term Redbone. And we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about some of my Redbone family. And what's really interesting is that a lot of people in the South, whether you're Melungeon, whether you're Creole, whether you're a bunch of any other things, you very likely have these names in your tree. Some of the big ones that we're going to talk about in this video: Drake, Chavez or Chavez, Goins or Goings. It's the same family, a little bit different spelling. So many of them had a similar experience. I was talking to Miss Amy Cross, who is an amazing genealogist, and she was kind of talking me through parts of this side of my family tree. And she asked such an interesting question. I was showing her how this family looked like it had come from Virginia, and then they came all the way to Louisiana and Texas. They're kind of in no man's land. And she's like, well, you have to ask yourself, why did this ancestor, John Drake, why did he and his wife leave Virginia?
If you want to discover maybe why that happened, you need to know a whole lot more about John Aaron Drake. And in all honesty, children sometimes give you what you need to. So don't neglect the other children. And so that's where I would tell you to go, because I feel like there's a whole lot more you can do on him, because this to me is a fascinating story. If this were me, this is something that I would like to know more about as well. Why did they leave Virginia? Why did they wind up in Louisiana? And on this family line, this is where it happened.
I didn't have an answer. I didn't totally know. And I thought that is such a great starting point for this story. And what I love about it is it creates this triangulation between these communities. I think even the Lumbee community get folded into this, where you see that there is a connection. We share ancestors. But why are we so spread out? This is why. Because as I started tracing my Louisiana family, I was like, well, some of these people have been in Louisiana a long time. Some people came from Virginia and North Carolina. I was like, why would you do that? Like, there is so much more going on the coast for the most part. And why would you make that big trek? I mean, we're talking 1780s, early 1800s. This is a massive trek to make. And these aren't people with high social status necessarily. These are people who on census records were called mulatto, mulatto libre, a free mulatto, black, all kinds of things. And so at this point, I was like, well, what's happening here? And I came across something that was so surprising to me that I had missed it. Like, I was so surprised I had missed it. And I'm a big numbers person. Like, I don't know. You know, some people don't care about numbers. And I'm like, numbers are, you know, to me, the building blocks of the universe. So I'm like, when numbers show up a certain way, I pay attention. I don't know. It's just my weird thing. But there were two dates that came up over the course of this, because my question was, well, why did they move? Well, let's go to Virginia. So in Virginia, one of my ancestors, his name was John Aaron Drake, and he was married to a woman who was born about the same time. Her name was Charity Chavez or Chavis. And these are last names that if you're from any of the communities I mentioned before, I'm sure that you know them or have them in your tree. And so both of these people were listed as mulatto, libre. These are free people of color. You know, that's a term you hear a lot in Louisiana. You see that a lot on my family records, free people of color. By the year 1806, now my family had already left by this point, but the screws were tightening. By the year 1806, Virginia had passed a law that said, basically, if you're not white, if you're mulatto or a free person of color, remember, that didn't just necessarily mean you're half black. That's not what that meant, but we'll get to that. Mulatto was a very complex term during that time. But basically by 1806, they said, you need to pack up your bags and get out of here, or you can be enslaved, because they were looking to get rid of free people of color as a group. They didn't want that. They wanted things more binary. Like, we need to know that, you know, we have free white people and now we have enslaved black people. And so if you're kind of in the middle, well, that messes that up, doesn't it? It gets real messy. So they said, you got to get out of here. So that's by 1806. Well, I can only imagine how my family was feeling the years leading up to this. You know, things don't just happen overnight usually. There's usually a slow buildup. Now, originally, John Aaron Drake, he was actually born in Virginia. And some of the work that was doing on the Drake family, it seemed like they may actually have ties to some of the native tribes in Virginia, but I couldn't figure that out for sure. So if you've done that work, let me know. I'd love to see it. I mentioned 1806. I want to tell you what was happening on the other side of the country in 1806. And then I want to talk to you about what mulatto means at this point, because it doesn't mean the way we use it now, even though we really don't use it now, probably shouldn't. 1806, so we're saying Virginia. 1806, they're tightening the screws on mixed race people. Okay, well, in 1806, in the middle of the country, the United States and Spain are having a boundary dispute. Because at this point, there's territory that they can't decide or agree who owns what and where does the line go. So what they decide to do is they both agree to create a strip that no one owns. No man's land, the neutral strip. Well, this territory was in between Texas and Louisiana. And so you have this strip that's just turns into almost like a Wild West situation. No one's really monitoring it, at least for a while. And it's pretty free from most of the laws that are happening on the East Coast and coming down south. So this wasn't something that was like formally ratified, but it was respected by both governments. And so this neutral territory allowed mixed race families, like my families, like the Drakes and the Goenses, to come and kind of elevate their social status by not having to play ball with the social status, if that makes sense. It was not the same experience for people of mixed race. There was more freedom. And you could kind of be in a community of people who had experiences like you, or maybe had the same background as you. And it was a really unique opportunity. And so you have this dichotomy happening where in 1806, Virginia is like, well, we want all these guys out of here. While in 1806, there's this new opportunity opening up. And so you can see why so many people from these families, the Drakes, the Goenses, the Travises, leaving Virginia, leaving North Carolina, coming to what is now Texas and Louisiana, coming to that neutral strip. And this is where the official Redbone community sprouts up. So let's talk about mulatto now, because in Virginia, there was a definition for what mulatto meant, and it did not mean half white and half black. The 1705 Virginia law, and I want to read right from here, and Virginia's Acts of the Assembly, they had racial classifications that broadened to include anyone of indigenous ancestry or African ancestry as mulatto. They weren't, unless it was specifically designated, it wasn't. And so the primary identification for John Aaron Drake and Charity Chavez was mulatto libre, a free mulatto, a free mixed race person. So they were able to, integrate so much more than in the Anglo-dominated colonies. So I want to tell you a little bit about Charity Chavez's story. So she was listed in her mother's household in the 1767 tax records of Granville County, North Carolina. If you're researching these families, this is like a big hit, right? You have the Lumbee over in that area now. And so even now you can start, if you had strings coming from all these places, you would see the strings coming down from Virginia to North Carolina, to South Carolina, and then over to Louisiana and Texas. And I have some theories about the Melungeon connection to this, but we'll get to that. And I actually have a document that I will put up about Charity that I found. And so she was a mulatto libre native of Virginia who married John Aaron Drake, mulatto libre of Elizabeth, Virginia. And then they had a son, this document says. His name was John Drake, which makes it really hard when you're doing family stuff. And he was called, this was literally his designation, mulatto libre natural de Carolina. So free mulatto native of Carolina. And he married a woman named Rosalie Abshire. So they were married in St. Martinsville, Louisiana in 1800. So then they have a child. And this is where the Goins family comes in. So they have a daughter named Seraphia, and she marries Jeremiah Goins. And the Goins family are, I feel like, the biggest family in the United States. I just had no idea how many there were. So they got married, and by 1834, they had moved into Texas during its Republic era, taking advantage of, at the time, Texas had looser social regulations on racial identity, and they allowed people of color to build new routes towards the frontier. Now, that would change. That would change after the Revolution. I have a video on that. I can link to that below. So Jeremiah Goins identified as Choctaw, but he was recorded in early Texas records as Negro, mulatto, even yellow.
I don't know, that one, I was just like, when I read it, like, I don't know. Again, it's crazy because we do white, black, all these things, but like seeing yellow, you don't hear it a lot. And I think it was so jarring. That color designation was so jarring. I'm like, they should all be that jarring, truly. But seeing yellow was pretty jarring. But it reflects the fluid and ambiguous labels that get placed on mixed race families. Before I keep going with the Goins family, I want to just talk about this connection that I'm just seeing between the Lumbee and the Melungeon and the Redbone, who are very often connected to Louisiana Creole families. And it just makes so much sense because I'm thinking, well, if people are coming over, fleeing Virginia because they have to, or they see the writing on the wall, and they're going, where can you go? You can't go east, that's the ocean. Like, you have to go west. Did some of those people go into the mountains of Appalachia and they ended up creating kind of their own isolated communities and joining up with people who are already there, and you end up with Melungeon identity, Melungeon culture. Then some people are headed over even further west. They're going to the neutral territory, and these are the people who end up being called Redbone historically. And of course, that name, those things have changed over time. But a lot of those people, I think, have, like my family, married into Creole families, and you get this mixture.
But to sum up the antebellum period, there were no legal importation of slaves to Louisiana from Africa or the Caribbean. Saint-Domingue and Cuban refugees who arrived between 1809 and 1810 in New Orleans did bring slaves with them. But they remained mostly in New Orleans and to a lesser extent in Point Capet, the Acadian and German coasts, all along the Mississippi River. Natalie Dessens's study, From Saint-Domingue to New Orleans, as well as Emily Clark's discuss this. The vast majority of slaves entering Louisiana during the antebellum period entered New Orleans slave market by way of the U.S. interstate market, mostly from Virginia, with smaller numbers from Kentucky, Maryland, and Tennessee. This is why so many Creoles in Grand Coteau and Sunset have English surnames. The Jesuits were ousted from Maryland in 1821 and they established a colony, with their slaves, at Grand Coteau that year. That colony became Sacred Heart Convent, Sacred Heart Church, now St. Charles Borromeo, and St. Charles College School for white boys. So by 1860, on all Creole plantations, there was a mixture of Creole, American, and really old African slaves, whereas on American plantations in Louisiana, virtually all slaves were Americans, with few Africans.
It's time traveling to stay. 10 years ago, I landed my dream job in New Orleans. I became the education coordinator at the Herman Grima House in the French Quarter. This is a historic home that was built in 1831. There was a Creole family that lived in the front, and the slave quarters were intact in the back of the house. My office was one of the rooms in the slave quarters. There's not a lot of information about who the enslaved people were that lived on the property in the 1830s, but there was some. And one of the stories was about a 10-year-old girl named Marie, and she was brought here from Baltimore by a slave trader named Austin Woolfolk. Her story always hit hard to me and stuck with me all these years because she was a little girl, and I imagined sitting in my office that was her bedroom. I always wondered what she was thinking and what had actually happened to her. I wanted to pay respect to Marie and find out her story as best I could. Right. I am standing in a cemetery in Rosedale, Louisiana. This is not too far west of Baton Rouge, and the cemetery I've come to visit, is actually where Austin Woolfolk is buried. So if you look behind me, that big monument there is for Austin Woolfolk. Austin Woolfolk was a vicious slave trader in the early 1800s. He was the main trader between Baltimore, Maryland, and New Orleans. He's personally responsible for at least 2,000 enslaved people being brought down and sold in New Orleans. Austin Woolfolk was one of many successful slave traders working in the domestic slave trade in America in the early 1800s. After the U.S. government outlawed the international slave trade in 1807, the demand for slaves did not suddenly stop. There were plantations and businesses which survived on the model of forced labor. The demand for slaves was high. There was money to be made. Slaves were still kidnapped and sold from Africa, but it was illegal, so there was a risk and a price associated with breaking that law. The alternative was the domestic slave trade. That means trading slaves within the United States. In the early 1800s, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were sold down south, coming from Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. In the Deep South, sugar and cotton plantations were thriving, while the tobacco industry in the Upper South was not doing as well. The slaves that were no longer needed were then sold down to New Orleans. Enter Austin Woolfolk. He was born in Georgia, but he moved to Maryland to make money in the domestic slave trade. He had a reputation of being particularly heartless and cruel, even savagely attacking an abolitionist who had called him out for being a slave trader.
One of the little girls that he's responsible for bringing to New Orleans and selling is a little girl named Marie, and he brought her from Baltimore when she was 10 years old.
10-year-old Marie was among over 2,000 people taken from the Maryland area and brought to New Orleans in a cargo ship paid for by Austin Woolfolk. Here's how it worked. Austin Woolfolk posted an ad in the newspaper requesting slaves, no questions asked. Most of the slaves he wanted were young, between 15 and 29 years of age. Almost all of them came alone without any family. He purchased them and put them in a slave pen, which looks just like a jail. He hired a ship captain to steer a cargo ship to New Orleans with the enslaved people in the bottom of the boat, loaded alongside wheat, manufactured goods, supplies, and near the bilge water that splashes into the boat. Upon arrival in New Orleans a month later, the enslaved people were immediately taken to another slave pen. Slave traders or brokers would come inspect the slaves for purchase. This is likely what happened to little Marie. Samuel Herman was a commodities broker. He bought and sold stuff for other people. He would have likely visited one of these slave pens with the intention of buying his daughter, Marie Virginie, a younger girl, to take care of her.
Marie Virginie was about 15 years old, so 5 years older than the little girl Marie. And Marie Virginie was going to go on to get married in about 5 years. So little Marie was brought here and sold here to kind of prep Marie Virginie for marriage and for motherhood.
Marie would have been taken back to this house at 820 St. Louis Street. She would likely have entered through the carriage house or this little alley doorway that was just for enslaved people. Upon entering the property, she would have been assigned a room in the newly constructed slave quarters.
So I just came to see his grave and see. I'm kind of surprised that there's such a large monument here for him, being that he was a slave trader. But he also was in the Battle of New Orleans, I believe, or in the War of 1812 with Andrew Jackson.
Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll tell you more about each step of this process, the laws that regulated the slave trade, and the day-to-day life a little girl like Marie probably faced.
Four generations of Louisiana women, wives, mothers, daughters, working endless days on a remote sugar plantation far removed from the expanding American way of life. Family, tradition, sacrifice. Nanette, Elizabeth, Desiree, and Laura, who wrote the stories down. Today, at Laura, a Creole plantation only 1 hour from New Orleans, experience the world of these remarkable women through the eyes of a Creole.
The GU-272 Legacy. In 1838, Maryland's Jesuit priests sold hundreds of men, women, and children to southern plantations to raise money for the construction of Georgetown University. Though they faced incredible hardship, most didn't perish. They married and raised children. Today, more than 8,000 of their descendants have been located through genealogical research.
The Georgetown sale was one of thousands that forcefully migrated more than 1 million men, women, and children from Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C.
There are about 10,000 descendants, and of that number, maybe half are still living.
It's personal to me. Some of the greatest men in this country were educated in Georgetown on our ancestors' backs.
For me, it was an opportunity to face the truth, to understand my own background and my own ancestry.
The first contact was on September 1 of 2016, when Georgetown was making an announcement about a task force report.
Throughout this past year, as the Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation conducted their related efforts, they sponsored...
Georgetown created a commission.
The working group completed its work over the summer.
The descendant community asked for representation on that commission. They were denied.
Okay. Gentlemen, right behind you, please introduce yourself.
May I please join you?
Well, sure.
My name is Joe Stewart, and I'm a descendant of the 272. And I've invited other members of the 272 here to join us today. One of the working groups said that what was missing from this scenario was the faces of the slaves. Here are the faces. These are the faces. To date, we have not had the privilege in working with the working group. You don't start reconciling by alienating. And our attitude is nothing about us without us.
Yeah, I do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Just like Michael, Epatha Murgison has roots in the Deep South. Her mother was born in the tiny town of Marigouin, Louisiana. And Epatha believes that her ancestors have been in and around Marigouin for generations. But beyond that, the shape of her family tree is a mystery.
I've always wanted to know where we came from. And I have no idea other than Marigouin.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I was 16, I got one of those little cassette recorders, and my grandmother was visiting. And I said to her, we called her Mama Pearl, I said, talk to me about when you grew up. And she was like, no, turn that thing off. You don't want to hear this. And I said, I do, I want to know. And she said, it's painful. You don't need to hear any of this.
Our researchers were able to discover some of what Mama Pearl withheld. Census and marriage records took us back to Pearl's mother, Epatha's great-grandmother, a woman named Easter Hawkins, and indicated that her parents, Peter and Martha, were both born in Maryland, likely in slavery. That's where the paper trail ran out. We couldn't find records to take us further, but then we noticed something in Epatha's DNA. And suddenly, the wall erected by slavery began to tumble down.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
Now, this is a chart showing a genetic network. People who share significant amounts of DNA with you and your mother. Each of these people is related to you in some way.
Oh, my God.
So guess what all these people have in common?
What?
You and everybody on that page trace your ancestry to one person. You read the name at the top?
Patrick Hawkins.
Does the name Hawkins ring a bell?
Oh, back.
Yeah, go back to
to Easter.
Great-grandmother Easter's maiden name.
Hawkins.
Hawkins.
Wow.
So that means that Patrick Hawkins was more than likely one of your direct ancestors. And since they share a surname, we imagine that he might somehow be connected to Easter, your great-grandmother. Isn't that incredible?
That's amazing.
Just through DNA.
That's amazing.
Now we face the question, how was this man, Patrick Hawkins, born over 2 centuries ago, likely in Maryland, possibly related to Epatha? To find out, our genetic genealogist C.C. Moore began searching for a link, combing through DNA databases and comparing those results with records on the paper trail. Through painstaking research, she uncovered a story unlike any we'd ever encountered before. It begins in the archives of Georgetown University, where in 1838, the Jesuit priest who ran the school sold a group of slaves to 2 planters in Louisiana. The documentation of this sale was invaluable because it listed the slaves who were sold by name. And one name stood out immediately.
Patrick, a man 35 years of age.
Now you remember all your DNA cousins?
Yes.
Who descend from Patrick?
Yes.
That's Patrick Hawkins.
And that's how they got from Maryland to Louisiana.
He was sold by the Jesuit leaders of Georgetown University to Louisiana planters in the year 1838.
Wow. Okay. It boggles the mind for Georgetown University. A Jesuit priest.
A Jesuit priest selling 272 slaves. Epatha was still uncertain how Patrick Hawkins was related to her, but that was about to change. Georgetown's archives contained an inventory compiled in preparation for the sale. It lists the slaves that were to be sold according to where they worked, and it identifies their family members.
White Marsh Farm, Isaac about 65 years. Patrick, Isaac's second son, 35 years. Letty, his wife. Peter, his son, 5.
You know what you're looking at? You're looking at the names of your family.
Wow. I'm descendant from these.
These are your people. This is your family tree in that record of slaves.
Wow.
There's your 3rd great-grandfather, Patrick Hawkins. We know his wife's name, Letty.
Letty.
Letty is your 3rd great-grandmother, Epatha. And their 5-year-old son is your great-great-grandfather, Peter.
They have names. That's amazing. Wow. That's amazing. They have names. They're not just faceless people.
Right. They're real people with names, and they had children and grandchildren, and they named them.
Yeah.
And they passed those names down.
Yeah. Wow. This is pretty amazing.
All told, Epatha descends from at least 9 slaves who were owned by the Jesuits, including no less than 3 generations of her Hawkins family line. For an African-American family, this was an astonishing discovery.
And you see the mentality of the people you come from, and you realize those things can and do get passed along.
We had already shown Epatha Murkison how her maternal ancestors, the Hawkins family, arrived in Louisiana, revealing that they had been sold into the Deep South by Jesuit leaders in 1838. But there was still more to the story. And to appreciate it, we needed to step back in time, back to the 1630s, when Jesuit priests arrived in Maryland, fleeing religious persecution in England. To support themselves in their mission, which came to include Georgetown University, the Jesuits began operating tobacco farms. By 1838, they had 6 Maryland plantations, covering almost 12,000 acres. And to run them, they needed labor.
And you might be able to guess what kind of laborers they used.
My family. Wow, that's extraordinary. So they left England to be free from persecution, to practice religion, and then they persecute folks when they get here.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
By 1838, the Jesuits owned close to 300 slaves, including 3 generations of your family, your bloodline.
Wow. This is like a trip.
The Jesuit plantations operated for more than a century. But in the early 1800s, Maryland's tobacco market declined, and the Jesuits struggled to keep up. As debts mounted, the very survival of their prized university was at stake. The documentation of this process still exists in the archives of Georgetown, allowing us a unique glimpse into the mindset of the men who owned Epatha's ancestors, and the mechanism by which her family was forever altered.
Were the servants sold, 1,000 could be made from the land besides supporting the missionaries. The sale of the servants should bring at least 16,000, which would bring 1,000 interest.
In 1833, the priests then began considering selling their slaves, referred to there as servants, in order to raise funds. When the sale was finally approved in 1836 by the Catholic Church in Rome, the university found a Catholic buyer in Louisiana willing to pay $115,000 for the slaves, which converts to between $3.3 and $7.5 million today. It's difficult to know the precise value, but what is agreed upon by scholars is that the university owes its very survival, its existence today, to the sale of black human beings, including people whose bloodline goes directly from 1838
to me.
S. Epatha Murkison. Incredible.
This is quite extraordinary. A university, a religious organization. Okay. Wow. I really don't know what to say that you can air. I just feel like anybody I know should be able to go to Georgetown. You know what I'm saying? They should be able to go to Georgetown for free.
I agree.
That's how I feel. And maybe I'll just go there and take some classes.
Epatha's words may very well prove prophetic. Georgetown University is still wrestling with the implications of the sale. An independent group called the Georgetown Memory Project has calculated that the 272 slaves sold in 1838 have at least 6,000 living descendants today. Initially, a university official tried to deny this, claiming that the slaves succumbed to fever upon arriving in Louisiana. But the truth eventually came out.
In 2016, the president of Georgetown, John DeGioia, made an official apology and held an open conversation on Georgetown's history.
All of this is going on.
Yeah, in 2016, after students demonstrated. Isn't that amazing?
And my sister's like an avid newspaper reader, so she's probably read about this.
Well, when you get home, you just Google Georgetown and slaves, and you'll see.
I'm gonna have to.
It was huge.
That's crazy. And so this story of my family is still alive.
Mm-hmm. I want to show you one more thing.
Okay.
Would you please turn the page?
All right.
Now, you see that? Any idea what that is?
Isaac Hawkins Hall.
The university decided to rename one of their buildings as part of the larger effort to address this history. So they renamed that building
Isaac Hawkins Hall.
in memory of your 4th great grandfather.
All over here.
You know why?
Oh my God.
Because Isaac's was the first name on that 1838 sale document. Of all those people, it started with your 4th great grandfather.
Oh my gosh. Look at that. Amazing. Spirit of Georgetown Residential Academy. Isaac Hawkins Hall. I love this.
How amazing is that?
Yeah, wow.
And you are directly descended from this guy. You have DNA from this man. He's your great-great-great-great-grandfather.
That's deep.
It's deep.
That's really deep.
You couldn't have made this up.
No, I'm telling you. I'm telling you.
So this is the story behind the story of what happened when I was reporting on slavery at Georgetown University and found my family's last name listed among the others enslaved. Yeah, there's a lot here, so get cozy, folks. Back in 2021, I was working on a piece about reparations at colleges and universities and quickly learned about the GU 272.
272 people out of about 1,000 total who had been owned by Georgetown University and the Maryland Jesuits. And those 272 were people who were sold all at once and all together to 3 sugar plantations in southern Louisiana to rescue Georgetown from bankruptcy.
So that's Richard, and he leads this organization called the Georgetown Memory Project, which works to try and identify descendants of the enslaved at Georgetown. Richard says he usually looks for a few things when trying to identify descendants. So if they're of mixed race background, if they're Catholic, if they have family in Louisiana, and if they have one of the last names listed.
If somebody can check 2, 3, or 4 of those boxes, suddenly you go, bing, this person is almost certainly a descendant of the GU 272.
After I spoke with Richard, I actually went through the document of the GU 272 line by line, reading all the names, and that's when I found Harriet Eaglin. I was shocked to see her name. I was shocked to see my name on this document, but it confirmed my suspicions that there was some relation because there was just too many coincidences of what Richard was telling me about the GU 272 and my own family. This was a complicated moment because as a journalist, we're constantly told to distance ourselves from our stories and that we are not the story, right? We are supposed to elevate voices, highlight issues, hold people accountable. But this was such a glaring fact that I could not ignore or deny and continue to report on this piece. And that was pretty much the scope of the first part of my reporting. I packaged that information up into a few different pieces. I actually won a Gracie Award for that reporting and got connected to so many other family members. But I still had so many questions like, where did Harriet go? Where are her descendants? Am I a descendant of her? How did my family even go from being in documented bondage to current landowners in Louisiana today? I knew I had to go down there and find out. My dad also happened to be there for a work trip, so I tried to include him a bit, and we started our adventure by getting some beignets. So we used to come here every summer. How does it feel to be back?
For me, this is an adventure. When I was your age, I didn't know that much about our family background. So you were helping your father to discover more about, our ancestry.
All right, back to getting some answers. So I was calling, emailing people around, looking for someone doing this research on the ground, and ultimately got connected with Charles Jagno, who's the clerk of court for St. Landry Parish, and Alex Lee, who's the parish archivist.
Spanish influence, French influence, Indians, blacks, Creoles, and free people of color. It was quite a mixture. You had white merchants, you had black merchants, you had white plantation owners, you had black plantation owners.
Everything Charles told me really aligned with some of the stories my dad told me about our family and the area we're from. But my interview with Alex started off with a surprise.
We're actually relatives.
That is unbelievable. How are we related?
We actually related in a multiple ways, so that's why I kind of laughed when I started to go through your request. As soon as I saw the Guillory, I was like, I'm definitely dealing with a relative.
So that Guillory is my grandmother, my dad's mother, and I didn't really get to know her much because she passed away when I was young. Her family's property is completely separate from the Eaglin land that we own today. But what Alex shared with me next was pretty tough to hear.
It's reversed to the common narrative that we hear that only whites own slaves. But in your family, well, in our family, the free blacks actually own slaves.
I was completely shocked by this news. I'll speak for myself as a lighter-skinned Black American. It is something that I feared learning about one day, right? Like, no one in my family knows when or how or why our physical traits changed, right? But hearing the verbal confirmation that it's because of this bondage, it is influenced by slavery, this is when it happened, was very intense to hear, but allowed me to think more about my own Blackness, what Blackness is, and understanding the complicated layers of all that. And then Alex showed me the original land records of the Eaglin property.
This is a record dated in 1881 of the origins of that property being passed down to the different heirs. Rosalie Eaglin, which is your ancestor's sister, she sold the land to her mom.
And then that property just got passed down, I guess, in the Eaglin line?
Exactly.
I learned so much about my family in that courthouse. No one had any idea that we've had that land for 141 years. And seeing the photos that Alex picked out for me was so healing. When I was growing up, sometimes I didn't feel like I looked exactly like my other family members, but being able to see the relation and similarities was an incredible moment. The next part of my journey led me to Grand Coteau at the Academy of the Sacred Heart. This was a super old Catholic school, but I found out in my research that there were actually Eaglins enslaved there. I met up with Caroline, who was a director and historian at Sacred Heart, and asked her if she thought I was connected to Harriet Eaglin in some way.
I think there's undoubtedly a connection between them. I think just the size of the Eaglin family, the connections with Maryland, with Louisiana, I think there most definitely is a relation there.
Caroline then had an incredible surprise for me. She introduced me to Sharon and her mother, who both worked at the Academy and also were a part of the Eaglin family. So we're all Eaglins. Right. Sharon, our ancestors were enslaved here. How does it feel being on these grounds?
It feels amazing. It's an opportunity most people are not going to be able to get.
I had never seen or looked inside slave quarters, and this building was still being used as storage, but even just being in that area, there was a dark energy there. There was sadness. And Sharon pointed out to me that on the bricks of that building, you can still see the fingerprints from the slaves that made them. After that, we went to a graveyard where there was a memorial to all the families enslaved at the Sacred Heart, and my family's name was on that as well. I was sad at this memorial. It was a lot to think about the type of life that my ancestors lived there, but I also felt this immense amount of pride for knowing how far their sacrifices and lifestyle went, knowing all the accomplishments and amazing things that my family has today. And none of it would have been possible without them. So I wanted to definitely show my respect and gratitude. And it was a very reflective moment.
The names you see here, they are the ones that did live in the slave quarters. You know, as you look around, you see other Eaglins in the graveyard. So they're home.
All right, I know that was a lot, but now that I had these pieces together, I was so eager to share it with my family. So we headed down to the Eaglin farm in St. Landry Parish, where my uncle lives today, and I also got to interview my dad.
When you were growing up, did you all ever talk about the history of the land or how we even got the farm?
Occasionally you would hear one of the uncles or aunts that would speak about a couple of the greater uncles or greater aunts as to how they may have ended up here. Unfortunately, I don't remember all of those conversations quite as well.
You know, we were kids. The adults may have had discussions. We were a Creole family. We knew a bit about our roots. Your maternal grandparents only spoke Creole.
Growing up, it was still before the civil rights movement, before integration. How did that impact your life?
I can still remember the separate entrances to places here for whites and blacks. Separate water fountains, went to separate public school systems. Louisiana in general has a nasty history with relation to skin tone. You know, there was this notion that there was a brown bag test, that if your complexion was darker than a brown bag, even though you were African American or at that time considered to be colored or Creole as it were, you were limited in terms of what you could in fact do. And there is no question about it that complexion was taken into account even within our own community, especially within our own community.
Now look, my dad is not a super emotive person by any means, but I was really impressed by how much he was sharing, and it was so special getting to interview him for the first time. Me, on the other hand, I feel like I was a ball of emotions. I had that like pit in your throat the moment I stepped onto the farm. And I think it's because I was still processing everything I learned and also starting to freak out about the future.
As far as the eye could see, there were rows and rows, acres of sweet potato. The fact that that ranch land has now been turned into homes, it's wonderful. Progress, you can't stop progress. But in some ways, I hope that we could literally stop time for a short period of time and maintain what we've had here for so long in the family.
Our farm isn't alone in this new reality. The USDA has shown a steady decline in the number of farms in the country. In 2021, there was just a little over 2 million, down 200,000 from 2007. Aside from these developments, my family still hasn't figured out who's taking care of this land next.
Honestly, Dad, one of my fears is that our land could look like that one day. What would it mean to you if we had to say goodbye?
I'm not certain. I probably I would insist that there be a clause so that there would be located a little obelisk, some kind of notation here with the family name on it. And I see you are tearing up about it, honey. Listen, I know how much great memories you have for this land here. But listen, you and your sister should always feel comfortable that you had the opportunity, and the times that you had with your cousins.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Those memories will never go away. You will have them in your heart.
I honestly did not plan or want to get that emotional during an interview, but I realized I had not been on the property in 5 years, and being there with my dad was a really special moment for me, especially after learning about the history of bondage in our family and finding out that over the last 140 years, we've worked really hard to keep this land. Somewhere deep down inside of me, I have this fear that that could have been the last time I was on the land with it in our family's name, or with my dad on the land in our family's name. So I felt all the feels. It definitely hit me. So the takeaway for me is simply gratitude. I was not expecting to find this much information or be able to go back as far as I did in this research. And I understand that that is an immense privilege. So many other people, especially Black Americans, get stopped in their ancestral search because there just are not existing or preserved documents, right? And I just met so many incredible people who opened their resources to me to help answer some of these questions. And it was just an incredible journey. I am so floored at the reach of this piece. Even still, I'm getting more clues and hints and stories from other cousins I'd never met before. And that has been such an incredible gift. So if you're interested in your own ancestral search, start today. You know, you can go online on some of the databases. You can just ask and record some questions to your family members. And being able to pass that knowledge down is just such a wonderful and beautiful thing you can do for your family, but also future generations. All right, that is the story behind the story. By far the most personal reporting I had ever done. I have no idea where this story will launch me on next, but if there's another adventure, I hope y'all will stay tuned.
By 1840, Americans outnumbered Creoles, whereas at the time of the purchase the Creoles outnumbered the foreign Americans 7-1. By mid-century it was clear that the Americans had achieved political and commercial dominance, while the Creoles still had social and cultural prestige and the French language remained prevalent in the city.